After a gap of over a year, I've started making a game a week again, with a new channel dedicated to my devlogs because my old channel has been completely taken over by narrative analysis video of 80s video games. You never really know what'll take off. The first week of August 2024 has seen the release of Rarebit, a cheese-themed force-scrolling horizontal shooter inspired by Gradius, Parodius, Megamania, and a newspaper comic from 1904 called Dream of the Rarebit Fiend. Rarebit is basically cheese on toast, and back then the belief was that eating toasted cheese before bed would lead to bad dreams, hence the shooter in which you are a dreamer trying to keep the cheese of your dreams from destroying you. That theme came later though. In the planning phase, all I knew was that I wanted to make a forced scrolling shooter. I've made shooters before, but my Exterminator didn't really have a stage so much as a scrolling background and an enemy generator. I wanted something more like the mid-80s shooters I saw in the arcades as a kid. Yes, I'm that old. Instead of a procedurally generated stage that the player would have to adapt to on the fly, I opted for something where memorizing enemy patterns and the stage layout would be a key. Given that I only give myself a week, that probably meant I'd have time to produce a single tile map, and that meant a single long level, something that would take 5 to 10 minutes to complete. For these projects, I like to spend a day or two planning, and for this project I'm using Obsidian, note-taking software that lets you use internal links like a personal offline wiki. There's a Kanban board plugin for it that let me track specific development tasks, and I divided mine up into folders for planning, mechanics, assets, and polish. The visual theme came late. Ultimately, I'm not a great artist, so the enemies would look like whatever I felt like I could work out the sprites for, in the vein of Parodius or the Intellivision game Megamania, which had food and household objects as enemies. Sure, I could have just done ships, but I had the germ of an idea that you're dreaming and destroying mundane fears and anxieties like your boss or traffic. Accordingly, what mattered in terms of enemies were their mechanics, what their movements and attack patterns were. I came up with a list of 20 possible types, and then a list of 7 possible power-ups for the player, and a half dozen secrets I might implement if I had the time. Friends, I did not have the time. After spending a day planning, I jumped into the mechanics, implemented basic ship movement, and the foundations of a new component-based state mechanic, basically turning enemy objects into collections of parts that could be swapped around. Godot is good with that kind of architecture, as everything is a node, but I was approaching it at a level I hadn't tried before, so things were a little slow. I implemented the hitboxes and the hurt boxes, the core enemy class, shooting and destruction, parallax background, and the scrolling itself. These last two took me longer than they should have to implement, blowing through the time I'd budgeted to craft the game's mechanics, from 2 days to nearly 5. Even if I allowed myself to overshoot my week to 10 days, I was running out of time, so I ended up only implementing 5 enemy types. That's fine though. Planning big is perfectly okay as long as you have the sense of what to cut and the discipline to kill your darlings. I gave up on the idea of hidden secrets and power-ups, so more of a Vanguard or a Xevious than a Gradius. After that, I set out to create the game's assets, the art, the sound, the UI, level layout, with only a couple days to work on it. The first enemy sprite I worked up was a wedge of cheese. The second, a grilled cheese sandwich. Then a wheel of cheese. I was apparently going with a cheese theme. And that's fine, that led me to the game's theme, cheese, which led me to the game's story about the dreamer who'd eaten too much cheese and having a nightmare about cheese. That reminded me of the Dreams of a Rarebit Fiend newspaper comic, so the player's triangle became a guy on a flying bed. Now that the enemies had sprites, I implemented the level layout itself with a placeholder tile map taken from my earlier game platformer, something I ended up liking enough that I didn't see the great need to replace it. UI was likely kept simple, menu screen, game over, victory screen if you make it to the end. Sound came last. In terms of effects, I only needed 2, the player shots and explosions, which I grabbed from some sound pack I'd picked up on Humble Bundle at some point, and the stage music was something chill and dreamy from a Creative Commons track. Normally, I'd come up with the effects at least on my own, but I was seriously running out of time at this point. And there you have it, a forced scrolling shooter done in 10 days at 2 or so hours a day. If I went back to develop it further, I'd add more stages, more enemy types, power-ups for different kinds of attacks, those secrets I mentioned, and I'd sharpen up the game's tile map, maybe add in some mini-bosses. Pretty up the art with some shaders. As it is though, Rarebit is a complete game experience lasting 5 minutes if you can beat it. Head on over to the game's page at itch.io and give it a spin. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want notifications when my next game comes out, and if you'd like to support my efforts, you can sign up for my Patreon or Camaraderie. You'll find links to those in the video notes.